February 18th, 1897. Smoke curls above the red earth of Benin City in the soft morning light. You hear boots crushing broken pottery. You hear shouted orders in clipped British accents. You smell gunpowder sweat and burning wood. Inside the royal palace compound, where sacred shrines have stood for centuries, bronze plaques that once gleamed on mud walls are being pried off with bayonets and rifle butts. Hundreds of plaques, thousands of years of memory cast in metal. Each one ripped away, dropped into waiting crates. Picture long courtyards lined with carved ivory tusks and bronze heads of kings. Priests have just finished their dawn rituals. The air still carries the scent of palm oil and incense. Then the doors crash open. Soldiers in khaki uniforms pour in. They do not bow. They do not ask questions. They are here for one purpose. Take everything that is not nailed down. Then burn whatever cannot be carried. Out beyond the palace walls, people are running. Mothers grab children. Old men clutch walking sticks and ancestral charms. They know that once these walls fall, their whole world falls with them. For more than 700 years, this city has been the center of a powerful black kingdom, a kingdom that traded as an equal with Portugal, a kingdom whose art astonished Europe. Now in a matter of hours, it is being looted and set on fire. Somewhere in the chaos, the Oba of Onramwen, the king of Benin, retreats into the forest. His palace is burning behind him. The shrines of his ancestors are in flames. The bronze plaques that told the story of his lineage from the earliest Obas to his own reign are disappearing into wooden crates stamped with British military markings. He knows that this is not just an attack on his body, it is an attack on his memory, on the memory of his people. In less than 3 days, more than 3,000 sacred objects will be torn from this city. Bronze heads, ivory tusks taller than a man, royal regalia, carved plaques that once covered the palace walls from floor to ceiling. They will be packed onto ships sent to London, to Berlin, to Paris. They will be sold at auction. They will be displayed behind glass. They will be locked in basements. And for more than 100 years, the world will be told that Africa had no history, no civilization, no art. And here is the part that should stop you cold. Those bronzes were created by black hands in West Africa. They were paid for with African wealth. They held the spiritual power of African ancestors. Yet today, they sit in European museums, making money for institutions built on empire, while the descendants of the people who made them still fight for basic wealth, basic justice, basic respect. How many times have you walked into a museum, seen African masks or sculptures, and read a small line that said something like, "Acquired in 1897"? No mention of invasion, no mention of burning cities, no mention of stolen lives and stolen futures. Just that one word, acquired. Like somebody picked it up at a yard sale. What happened in Benin in those February days was not a small incident on the edge of empire. It was one of the greatest art thefts in human history. It was economic warfare. It was spiritual warfare. And here is the part they do not want you to connect. The same mindset that burned that palace, that ripped those bronzes from the walls, is the mindset that built the wealth gap you see today. The mindset that says black beauty belongs behind someone else's glass. That black genius belongs in someone else's name. That black wealth belongs in someone else's bank. You were never supposed to hear this story in full. You were never supposed to picture that smoke, those crates, that king walking away from a burning palace. You were supposed to believe that Africa was dark, empty, backward. You were supposed to believe that your ancestors were poor, helpless, uncivilized, that they had nothing worth stealing. That was the lie. Today, we are going to tear into the truth. By the time you finish this video, you will see museums differently. You will see history differently. You will see yourself differently. You were told that Africa had no history before Europeans arrived. You were told that African art was primitive. You were told that the wealth in London, in Berlin, in Paris, somehow just appeared. That it was the result of hard work, discipline, and civilization. You were told that black people, both in Africa and in America, just could not get it together. After this video, that story dies. Because when you follow the trail of the Benin Bronzes, you are not just following pieces of metal and ivory. You are following stolen wealth. You are following burned records. You are following the deliberate destruction of black kingdoms that were already powerful, already rich, already sophisticated. You are following the paper trail of museums, governments, and universities that knew exactly what they were doing when they put stolen African treasures behind glass and called it preservation. This is not ancient history. The invasion of Benin happened in 1897. That is only a few generations back. With every year that passed, those stolen bronzes were appraised, insured, borrowed, traded, and admired. While your grandparents were working 2 and 3 jobs. While your parents were redlined out of home ownership. While your community was told to pull itself up by its bootstraps. By the end of this video, you will know 3 things deep in your bones. You will know that the Kingdom of Benin was not some small, forgotten village. It was a wealthy black empire that traded with Europe as an equal, that produced art so advanced, European scholars refused to believe black Africans had made it. You will know that the Benin Bronzes were not just decorative pieces. They were royal records, spiritual instruments, economic assets, and political symbols. And they were stolen in a planned military operation that set a whole city on fire. You will know that the same mindset that stole those bronzes is still operating today. In museum policies that refuse to return stolen art. In international laws designed to keep loot where it sits. In a global economy where black nations sit at the bottom of a pyramid built on their own stolen resources. And once you see all that, you will never look at a museum label or a history book or a story about African poverty the same way again. Because this is not just about some objects in glass cases overseas. This is about your family. This is about your ancestry. This is about your stolen inheritance. If your DNA test ever flashed that little line that said Benin Togo, this is about you. If your grandmother ever told you that you come from kings, but could not give you names, this is about you. If you have ever walked into a museum and felt that strange pull when you saw an African mask, like some old part of you recognized it, this is about you. When they burned that palace, when they shipped those bronzes across the ocean, they were not just stealing from a king. They were stealing from you, from your grandchildren, from your entire bloodline. So as you listen, this is not a lecture. This is a family conversation. This is your history opening up in front of you. This is God pulling the cover off lies that stood for more than a century. Stay with this. Let it sit in your spirit. Because the deeper we go, the more the pieces of your own life start to make sense. Now let us step back for a moment. Because to really feel the weight of what happened in that palace, you need to know what stood there before the smoke. You need to see who your ancestors were before the ships, before the chains, before the lies. Before we talk about the theft, we have to talk about the empire they stole from. Long before those British boots hit that red earth, there was a city that glowed in the West African sun. Benin City was not a random spot on the map. It was the beating heart of a kingdom that had been rising and ruling for centuries. We are talking about a kingdom that scholars trace back to around the 12th century. A kingdom in what is now southern Nigeria. It grew from a small cluster of villages into a powerful empire that shaped trade politics and culture across the region. By the 15th and 16th centuries, when Europe was just beginning to crawl out of the Middle Ages, Benin was already a major power. Imagine walls stretching around the city, so long and so complex that some modern researchers have compared them in scale to the Great Wall of China. Imagine roads lined with carefully planted trees leading toward the palace. Imagine a planned city, not chaos. Streets, compounds, shrines, order. At the center of it all stood the palace of the Oba, the king. Not a little house, a vast royal compound with courtyards, altars, carved pillars, and ancestral shrines. This was the seat of a dynasty that could trace its line back hundreds of years. Kings were not just political leaders, they were spiritual heads, commanders, and war guardians of tradition. When Portuguese traders arrived on the West African coast in the late 1400s, they did not find a people desperate for civilization. They found a kingdom that already had it. They established diplomatic relations with the Oba of Benin. They wrote home describing a court, so organized, a city so clean and ordered that it shocked them. Benin traded palm oil, ivory, pepper, textiles, and other goods. Portuguese traders brought copper and brass, which the people of Benin turned into breathtaking art. They also brought guns, which the Oba used carefully to strengthen his power and defend his kingdom. Trade was not charity, it was negotiation, it was strategy. Inside the palace, there was another kind of power at work, the power of the guilds, specialized families who had been casting bronze and brass for generations. They used the lost wax method, sculpting intricate wax models, coating them in clay, heating them so the wax melted out, then pouring in molten metal. When the mold broke away, what remained was a bronze head, a plaque, a bell, a pendant. Sharp, detailed, alive. These artists did not work for tourists. They worked for the Oba. Their job was sacred, to capture history in metal, to show the deeds of kings, to freeze important ceremonies in time, to preserve the memory of wars. One ambassadors received rituals performed. Walk with your mind through one of those palace courtyards. On the walls you see row after row of rectangular bronze plaques, each one about the size of a large book or a small window. Some show the Oba larger than the figures around him to symbolize his power. Some show lines of warriors with spears and shields. Some show Portuguese traders in their strange hats holding gifts. You are literally seeing the history of the kingdom arranged in metal chapters. These are not rough, primitive images. The figures have intricate coral bead necklaces, elaborate headdresses, detailed weapons. Every strand of hair, every fold of cloth, every mark of rank is there. European visitors who saw these works in the 19th century wrote in stunned awe. Many could not accept that African artists with no direct European training could create metalwork so sophisticated, and the bronzes were just one part of the royal art. There were life-sized carved elephant tusks covered with scenes and symbols. There were altars to ancestors with rows of cast brass heads crowned with coral. There were carved wooden doors and pillars. There were beaded crowns and coral bead-covered regalia that shone like living fire in the sun. Now think about what that means for you. Because while this was happening in West Africa, the trade in human beings was also rising. Ships sailed from these same coasts, carrying men, women, and children across the Atlantic into slavery. Many of those people came from the broader region that Europeans would later label as Benin and its neighbors. If your DNA profile shows Benin Togo, if your family comes from the American South, where many West African captives were taken, there is a real chance that your ancestors walked streets like these before they were forced onto ships. There is a real chance that the same hands that planted yams on plantations in Georgia once worked the soil near Benin City. That the same blood that carried cotton sacks in Mississippi once carried bronze and ivory in West Africa. You were told your ancestors came from nowhere. But they came from somewhere very specific. They came from kingdoms that had mapped their own roads, set their own laws, built their own universities of life. They came from cities that had streetlights before some parts of Europe, from communities that had complex systems for land inheritance and justice. This is not a fairy tale. This is documented history. Portuguese records, British records, archaeological digs, oral histories preserved by Edo people, the descendants of the Benin Kingdom. When you connect all those pieces, a picture emerges that no one ever drew for you in school. A black kingdom, wealthy, organized, artistic, powerful. Now, when you have a kingdom like that, with its own trade routes, its own sources of wealth, its own control over resources, like palm oil and ivory, what do you think happens when a rising empire like Britain looks at that map? Do you really think they saw a partner they wanted to uplift? Or did they see a target standing in the way of their total control? By the late 1800s, Britain had drawn its lines over much of West Africa. They were hungry for rubber, palm oil, gold, and access to inland markets. The Kingdom of Benin was one of the last strong independent powers they had not fully bent to their will. The Oba controlled trade in his territory. Foreign merchants could not just roll in and do what they pleased. That was a problem for empire, so they did what empires always do. They started looking for a way in, a pretext, an excuse that would sound good on paper when they wrote back to London. In January of 1897, that excuse arrived in the form of blood on a forest road. Acting Consul General James Phillips, a British official stationed on the coast, decided he was going to march into Benin City with a group of men and confront the Oba. He did this even though he knew the Oba had declared that time a sacred period when visitors were not allowed. He did this even though local chiefs warned him clearly, "Do not come now. The king is not receiving." Wait. Phillips ignored those warnings. He wrote letters ahead of time to his superiors, letters that still exist, in which he practically begged for permission to punish Benin. He talked about how much rubber and other goods could be taken. He offered to pay for a military expedition with the loot. That is how openly he thought about this kingdom. Not as a sovereign state, as a vault to be cracked. On January 4, 1897, Phillips and his party left for Benin City. They traveled with carriers and a small escort, not a full army, because they believed their British status would keep them safe. But the kingdom had its own laws, its own rhythms, its own sacred cycles. To them, this was not just rude, it was a spiritual violation. Near a village called Benin Benin, warriors ambushed the party. Most of the British men, including Phillips, were killed. Only a couple survived and made it back to the coast with the story. The response from Britain was swift and cold. They called it the Benin massacre. They did not mention the letters where Phillips basically announced his desire to start a war. They did not mention the warnings he ignored. They focused on one thing: white men had been killed. And in the logic of empire, that meant punishment. Within weeks, London approved a full-scale military expedition. They gathered over 1,000 troops, sailors, marines, African soldiers under British command. They brought machine guns, artillery. They mapped their routes carefully. They knew exactly where they were headed. Straight to Benin City, straight to the palace, straight to the vault. They called it a punitive expedition, a mission to punish a savage king and bring order to a chaotic land. That was the story printed in British newspapers. That was the story told in parliamentary debates. That was the story that would be written in many history books. But if you read the private letters, the reports from officers, the lists drawn up after the invasion, you see the real mission. They talked constantly about loot, about ivory tusks, about bronzes, about how the sale of these items would repay the costs of the expedition. They were going not just to fight, they were going to steal. Between late January and February of 1897, British forces advanced toward Benin City from multiple directions. They burned villages along the way. They fought off resistance from Benin warriors who tried desperately to hold the line with older weapons against rapid-fire guns. For about 10 days, the road to the capital turned into a trail of smoke. When they finally reached Benin City around mid-February, the fighting that followed was brutal and uneven. The Oba's forces were brave, but courage alone cannot stop machine guns. After heavy clashes, British troops broke through the defensive lines and entered the city. Now pause and picture that moment. You have this vast palace complex, courtyards, halls, shrines, altars piled with cast brass heads of ancestors and ivory tusks carved with scenes of royal history. The air is thick with dust from crumbling walls, with the metallic smell of blood, with the crackle of fires already starting in nearby compounds. British soldiers smash open doors. They step into rooms full of bronzes, ivory coral, and sacred regalia. Some of them have never seen anything like it. European museums at that time rarely held such dense, concentrated collections of non-European royal art in one place. Here in front of them is an unguarded treasury. Officers shout quick orders. Some focus on securing the area. Others focus immediately on cataloging, packing, and removing the most obviously valuable pieces. Men pry bronze plaques from the palace walls. Each one has been hanging there for generations, maybe longer than the British Empire has even existed. Now they hit them with rifle butts. They yank them down. They stack them like firewood. In one courtyard, they find a row of huge elephant tusks, each one carved from base to tip with patterns and scenes. These have stood on royal altars, representing power and connection to the spirit world. Soldiers gather them, strap them to carrying poles, haul them away. They step over shrines, knock over sacred objects. To them, these are curiosities. To the people of Benin, these are living points of contact with their ancestors. In the space of hours, those altars are broken. The loot piles grow. Bronze heads of kings with high coral crowns, relief plaques showing battles and ceremonies, ritual bells and staffs, coral and agate beadwork, royal costumes heavy with meaning. It all goes into crates. Some of the officers, like any good thieves, think about their own cut. They select particularly fine pieces to claim as personal souvenirs. They pose for photographs with stacks of stolen art behind them. They write letters home, bragging about the treasures they have found. Then comes fire. To break any remaining resistance and to send a clear message, British troops set large parts of Benin City on fire. The palace burns. The wooden structures, the thatched roofs, the carved pillars, all feed the flames. Documents kept in palace stores, perhaps chronicles, trade records, royal decrees, are lost forever. Whatever history was written, there goes up into the sky as ash. For days, smoke hangs over the ruins. People who flee the city carry nothing but trauma and memories. Behind them, in the charred remains, British paper pushers start tallying the haul. No one knows the exact number, but historians estimate that between 3,000 and as many as 10,000 artworks left Benin in the wake of that invasion. That includes the famous plaques, the heads, the tusks, and many other items large and small. Within months, auctions are held in London. Museums and private collectors from across Europe line up to buy. The British Museum takes a large share. So do other institutions in Germany, Austria, and elsewhere. Some pieces end up in the hands of individual officers who later sell them or pass them down as heirlooms. Today, scholars have tracked thousands of these pieces in more than 100 institutions worldwide. And that does not even count the ones sitting in private collections, unseen, unrecorded, still silently testifying to a day of fire and theft in 1897. Now think back to the image we started with. Smoke rising, crates filling, a king walking away from a burning palace. The official reports will say that the British punished a wicked ruler, ended human sacrifice, and opened the region to trade and progress. That is the story they sold to the world. But when you follow the money, when you follow the bronzes, another story appears. The story of a kingdom stripped of its greatest treasures, so that an empire could enrich itself. The story of history ripped from the walls and shipped across oceans. The story of a people left standing in the ashes, told that their loss was necessary for someone else's civilization. And here is the part you need to hold in your mind as we move forward. Those objects did not just vanish into some neutral space. They became part of the foundation of European museums. They were displayed as proof of empire, as trophies, as ornaments for the same societies that claimed Africa had given the world nothing. When you see it that way, you start to understand why the story of Benin was kept so quiet for so long. Why school books either skipped it or dressed it up as a simple chapter in the march of progress. Because if people knew that black kingdoms like Benin existed, that they created wealth and art on this level, that they were deliberately attacked and robbed, then a whole lot of excuses for the present would fall apart. So far you have seen the scene, you have met the kingdom, you have watched the first act of the robbery. But the real shock comes when you see how far this pattern goes, how many times it repeats, and how directly it connects to what you and your family are living with right now. We are just getting started. Oba Ovonramwen did not stand trial in his own city. He did not face a council of his own people. After months of hiding in the forest, moving between safe houses, watching for British patrols, he finally surrendered in August of 1897. The terms were simple. Give yourself up, or we burn what is left of your kingdom to the ground. He came out with his hands open, and the British shipped him off to exile, not to a palace, not even to a prison in his own land. They sent him to Calabar, hundreds of miles away on the coast. A king torn from the throne his ancestors had held for 700 years, forced to live in a foreign compound under guard until he died. He never saw Benin City again. He never stood in the courtyards where his father and grandfather had performed rituals. He never touched the walls where the bronze plaques used to hang. He died in exile in 1914, 17 years after the invasion, knowing that everything he was supposed to protect had been scattered across the ocean. Back in Benin, the British installed a new system. They placed someone they could control on the throne, someone who would take orders. The trade networks that had once funneled wealth into the royal treasury were broken open and redirected toward British commercial interests. Palm oil, rubber, timber. All of it now moved through colonial hands, taxed by colonial laws, shipped to feed colonial industries. The kingdom itself was folded into what would eventually become the colony of Nigeria. Borders were drawn, languages were mixed, ethnic groups were lumped together with no regard for ancient rivalries or alliances. The spiritual and political authority of the Oba, once absolute in his territory, became ceremonial at best. Power shifted to governors and administrators, who answered to London, not to local tradition. And the objects, the bronzes, the ivory, the regalia, they were already gone, already on display in glass cases thousands of miles away, already being appraised, catalogued, and admired by people who had no idea what those pieces really meant. In the museums, curators did not write labels that said stolen during a violent invasion in 1897. They wrote, acquired. They wrote, collected. They wrote, expedition. Clean, neutral words that hid the blood and the smoke. For the people left behind in Benin, the loss was not just economic, it was spiritual. In many African cultures, art is not just decoration. It carries the presence of ancestors. It holds history that cannot be written in books, because the culture passes memory through objects, through ritual, through the physical presence of sacred things. When those objects were ripped away, it was like tearing pages out of the Bible and scattering them across the world. You can survive it, but something inside you is broken. The continuity is gone. The connection is severed. Families that had served the Oba for generations, guilds of bronze casters, whose fathers and grandfathers had worked the palace forges, suddenly had no center. Their patrons were gone. Their sacred duty was over. The entire cultural ecosystem built around the royal court collapsed. Within a generation, children grew up hearing stories about the old days, but they could not see the bronzes. They could not touch the ivory. They could not stand in front of the altars and feel the weight of their lineage. That physical memory was locked behind glass in London, Berlin, Vienna, and dozens of other cities across Europe and America. Now some of you might be thinking, okay, this is a sad story, but what does it have to do with me? I was not born in Benin. My family has been in America for generations. Why should I care about some stolen art from a kingdom I have never seen? Here is why. Because the same mindset that burned that palace, that stole those bronzes, that exiled that king, is the mindset that shaped your entire world. The logic goes like this. Black people do not really own anything. Whatever they have can be taken. Whatever they build can be destroyed. And when it is gone, we will tell a story that makes it sound like they never had it in the first place. That logic did not stay in Africa. It crossed the ocean with every slave ship. It showed up in every law that said you could not own property, could not read, could not vote, could not sit in certain places, could not live in certain neighborhoods. It is the same logic that burned down Black Wall Street in Tulsa, that tore apart Rosewood in Florida, that bulldozed thriving black communities and called it urban renewal. Every single time black people built something, whether it was a kingdom in West Africa or a business district in Oklahoma, the pattern repeated. Destroy it. Steal it, erase it, then teach the next generation that it never existed. So when you ask what this has to do with you, the answer is everything. Because your ancestors on both sides of the ocean were told the same lie. You come from nothing. You have no history. You have no wealth. You have no culture worth saving. And when you believe that lie, you stop asking questions. You stop demanding what was taken. You accept poverty as natural. You accept the wealth gap as inevitable. You look at a white museum filled with African art, and you do not even get angry because no one ever told you it was yours. But now you know. Now we are going to go deeper, because Benin was not a one-time thing. Benin was the template. It was the pattern. And once you see how many times they ran this same playbook, you will never unsee it. Let me show you what I mean. 30 years before Benin British forces invaded Ethiopia. The year was 1868. Emperor Tewodros II had been holding some British hostages, trying to force diplomatic recognition and support. Britain responded with a military expedition. They marched into the highlands, fought their way to the fortress of Magdala, and defeated the Ethiopian forces. Tewodros took his own life rather than surrender. And what did the British do next? They looted his palace. Royal manuscripts, ancient religious texts, crowns, crosses, ceremonial robes, all of it packed up and shipped to England. Today, those treasures sit in the British Library, the British Museum, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. Ethiopia has been asking for them back for more than 150 years. The answer is always the same. We are preserving them. We are protecting them. You cannot have them. Same playbook, different country, different decade, same theft. move forward a few years. In the 1880s, King Leopold II of Belgium claimed the Congo as his personal property, not as a colony of Belgium, as his own private estate. He called it the Congo Free State, which might be the cruelest joke in history, because there was nothing free about it. Leopold wanted rubber. He wanted ivory. He wanted whatever he could pull out of the earth and sell in Europe. So he set up a system of forced labor, so brutal that it killed an estimated 10 million people. 10 million. Let that settle in your mind. An entire genocide driven by greed. His agents went village to village, forcing men to collect rubber under threat of death. If they did not meet quotas, hands were cut off. Families were taken hostage. Whole communities were burned. And while the people bled, Leopold stole everything: ivory, minerals, sacred artifacts, anything of value. When the world finally started paying attention and forced him to hand the territory over to the Belgian government, the theft did not stop. It just got a little more polite. The extraction continued. The wealth flowed out. The people stayed poor. Today, the Democratic Republic of Congo is one of the richest countries on earth in terms of natural resources: diamonds, cobalt, copper, gold. And yet it is also one of the poorest in terms of the actual lives people live there. Why? Because the system set up by Leopold never really ended. The resources still flow out. The profits still go somewhere else. And just like in Benin Congolese, cultural objects, masks, sculptures, royal regalia sit in European museums, stolen during the years of terror, displayed as exotic curiosities, labeled acquired. Now hop over to Egypt. You know the story, even if you have never thought about it this way. For over a century, European archaeologists and adventurers have been digging up Egyptian tombs, taking mummies, sarcophagi, jewelry statues, and shipping them back to London, Paris, Berlin, New York. They called it archaeology. They called it preservation. They said they were saving these treasures from local ignorance and neglect. But here is the truth. They were stealing the physical history of African people and locking it away in foreign museums so that Egypt's own children would have to buy plane tickets and stand in line to see their ancestors. The Rosetta Stone. One of the most important artifacts for understanding Egyptian history is in the British Museum. It was taken by the British from the French, who had taken it from Egypt. Neither side ever asked Egypt if they wanted it back. The bust of Nefertiti, one of the most iconic images of African beauty and power, sits in a museum in Berlin. Stolen during an excavation in the early 1900s. Germany has refused every request to return it. Thousands of mummies, thousands of pieces of jewelry, entire temple walls, all scattered across Western museums. Egypt, the cradle of one of the greatest civilizations in human history, has to beg for scraps of its own memory. Same playbook. Now let us talk about West Africa again, but this time French colonial rule. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, France swept through kingdoms in what are now Senegal, Mali, Guinea, and the country of Benin, which is not the same as the Kingdom of Benin, but is nearby and has its own story. One of the most famous examples is the Kingdom of Dahomey. The French invaded in the 1890s, defeated the king, and looted the royal palaces. They took statues, thrones, altars, and sacred objects tied to Vodun spiritual practices. Many of these items ended up in French museums. Today, it is estimated that French institutions hold over 90,000 African artifacts. 90,000. And for decades, France had laws on the books that made it illegal to return them. The argument was that objects in the national collection were inalienable, meaning they could never leave. In 2018, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, gave a speech in which he admitted that African heritage could not remain prisoner in European museums. He promised to start returning items. There was celebration. There were headlines. Finally, someone in power was saying the right thing. But then, what happened? The French government changed the laws just enough to allow a tiny handful of returns under very specific conditions. A few dozen items out of 90,000. And the process was made so slow, so bureaucratic, so full of legal hurdles, that it could take generations to return even a fraction of what was stolen. Same playbook. Admit a little guilt. Promise change. Then change nothing that matters. Do you see the pattern now? Benin, Ethiopia, Congo, Egypt, Dahomey, Mali, Senegal. Every single time a black civilization built something of value, Europeans came in, destroyed it, stole it, and then wrote history books that erased the whole thing. Every single time we created wealth, they took it. Every single time we built monuments, they knocked them down or carried them away. Every single time we recorded our history, they burned the records or locked them in a basement. This was not random. This was not a series of accidents. This was policy. This was strategy. This was the entire foundation of European wealth. They built their museums on our bones. They built their universities on our stolen knowledge. They built their economies on our stolen resources. And then they turned around and said, look at Africa, so poor, so backwards, so uncivilized. They need our help. The help they offered was the same help a thief offers when he breaks into your house, steals everything, burns it down, then comes back the next day with a pamphlet about fire safety. And here is the part that should make you furious. They did this to your ancestors too. Even if your family never set foot in Benin or Dahomey or Ethiopia, even if your lineage runs straight from a plantation in Virginia to a neighborhood in Detroit, the same pattern touched your life. Because the slave trade that brought your ancestors to America was part of this same system. European powers destabilized African kingdoms, fueled wars, captured people, and sold them across the ocean. The wealth generated by slavery built banks, factories, and entire cities in Europe and America. And when slavery ended, the theft did not stop. It just changed form. Sharecropping, convict leasing, redlining, urban renewal, mass incarceration. Every generation a new method. But the goal stayed the same. Extract wealth from black people. Prevent them from building anything that lasts. And if they manage to build it, anyway, burn it down. Tulsa, 1921. Greenwood was a thriving black neighborhood. People called it Black Wall Street. It had more black-owned businesses per capita than almost anywhere in America. Banks, hotels, theaters, doctors, lawyers, shops, wealth. On May 31st and June 1st, a white mob backed by local police and even deputized by the city descended on Greenwood. They burned 35 square blocks. They murdered an estimated 300 people. They looted homes and businesses. They dropped firebombs from airplanes. And then for decades it was erased from textbooks. It was not taught in Oklahoma schools. Survivors were told to stay quiet. Insurance companies refused to pay claims. The city changed zoning laws to make it nearly impossible to rebuild. If those families had been allowed to keep their wealth, to pass it down, to build on it, their descendants today would be millionaires. But the wealth was stolen, the records were destroyed, and the whole event was erased. Same playbook. Rosewood, Florida, 1923. A prosperous black town. Landowners, business people, families building generational wealth. A lie about a white woman sparked a white mob. They burned the town to the ground, killed residents, forced survivors to flee into the swamps. The town was never rebuilt. It literally disappeared from the map. Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898. Black people held political power in the city. They owned newspapers. They had representatives in government. White supremacists launched a coup. They burned the black newspaper. They murdered black leaders. They forced elected officials out at gunpoint. They installed their own government. This was not the old South of slavery days. This was 1898. This was after the Civil War, after Reconstruction. This was American citizens on American soil being attacked by domestic terrorists, who then wrote the history books and called it a race riot, as if black people started it. Elaine, Arkansas, 1919. Black sharecroppers tried to organize for fair pay. White mobs backed by federal troops hunted them down and killed hundreds. The exact number is still unknown because no one bothered to count black bodies. Every single time, the same pattern: build, destroy, steal, erase. You were never taught this in school. You might have heard whispers. You might have stumbled on a documentary, but the full weight of it, the systematic, deliberate, repeated destruction of black wealth, was kept out of the textbooks. Why? Because if you knew, you would start asking questions. You would start connecting dots. You would look at the wealth gap today, the fact that the median white household has about 8 times the wealth of the median black household, and you would stop accepting the explanations they give. They say it is about education, but we have educated people who still cannot build wealth because the systems are rigged. They say it is about work ethic, but our ancestors worked for free for 250 years and were never paid. They say it is about choices, but every time we made the choice to build, they made the choice to destroy. The wealth gap is not an accident. It is not a mystery. It is the direct result of centuries of theft. And the Benin Bronzes sitting in those museums are a perfect symbol of how it works. Create something beautiful, something valuable, something that proves your humanity and your genius. Then watch someone else take it, put it behind glass, and charge admission. Your ancestors created those bronzes. Your ancestors built those kingdoms. Your ancestors were the millionaires in Tulsa, the landowners in Rosewood, the political leaders in Wilmington. And it was all taken. Not because you were weak, not because you were inferior, but because the system was designed to take. Now you might be wondering if this is all so well documented, if the museums admit they have these objects, if historians know the invasions happened, why has nothing changed? Why are the bronzes still in London? Why are Ethiopian manuscripts still in British libraries? Why is Nefertiti still in Berlin? Because they built an entire infrastructure to make sure nothing ever has to be returned. Let me show you how the cover-up works.